Galaxy Brains. Podcast from Galaxy Research. Yo, I'm chillin' like a villainous Mr. Make a Million. We're back with a deadly new track. Talk back, get your credit called back, dog. When you talk smack, this your eulogy. You had a good life and all that, but now it's time to claw back and speak with some fluency. So miss me with the hate, you could call it truancy. My verbal acuity shocks the mind like lunacy. Blasphemous, I'm never repentant my flow, cause I mastered this. Heaven knows I'm the GOAT. Some say he's the menace, I call him Dennis Pourteaux. I hold mad grudges and I never forego, it's overrated. And everyone knows my flow debates it. I always make it and I never ever fake it. I'm mad real, a lunatic too true to spit the bad feels. I'm only max bidding, selling Alex is a bad deal. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorne, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy Digital. Thank you for listening to Galaxy Brains. We have a great show for you today. Dennis Pourteaux, Taproot Wizard, Bitcoin OG, longtime inscriber, is our guest. It's a fascinating interview about Bitcoin, Bitcoin development, and Bitcoin culture. I know you'll enjoy. I'm on vacation this week. I hope everyone had a great 4th of July long weekend. So we won't check in with Bimnet Abibi, our friend, but we'll reconnect with him next week on the show. And before we get into the show with Dennis, I need to remind you to please refer to the link to the disclaimer on the podcast notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Man, I don't know what we're on, like episode 70. Let's get right into it. Let's go now to our guest, Dennis Pourteaux, Bitcoin OG, friend of mine, founder of What Ventures, medical doctor, and a Taproot Wizard.
Indeed.
Dennis, welcome to Galaxy Brains. Thank you so much for coming.
So happy to be here. Awesome pad.
Yeah, so check out Dennis's Substack, by the way, read.Pourteaux.xyz. We'll put the link in the show notes. He's got some great pieces. One, just before we get rolling, last summer about Bitcoin culture. Really enjoyed that piece. It became extremely relevant, even more so after inscriptions became a thing and sort of caused a new divide in the Bitcoin community. We're going to dive into some stuff, I guess, right off the bat, though. Dennis, you have one of the first Taproot Wizards. You are a founding member of the Taproot Wizards.
Yes. That's true.
So, like, why? Or, like, how?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's part of the inscription story. And really, it's part of the story of that article that you mentioned where I was talking about Bitcoin culture. I really feel that the inscriptions and putting JPEGs on Bitcoin and people having fun again on Bitcoin really is the answer to that call that I made in that old article where I was lamenting the sorry state of beefsteak dinners on Bitcoin and not much diversity on the people that, go to these things and kind of just like doomerism in the space rather than people having fun and going to NFT parties and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I just have to say shout out to Josh. Big fan of beefsteaks specifically myself, but I hear you. There was a monoculture, certainly in my view from 2020 to 22 in particular.
Exactly. Like this isn't like part of OG Bitcoin.
People went kind of crazy during COVID and like, going way down the deep Bitcoin. And that I feel like it really became much more extreme. Some people say all the way back to the block size wars that it's really the small blocker till now that's the culture. But I actually thought it became much more acute and defined over the last couple of years.
I think that is true. And I can go on for this for a long time, but I think some of it is like this zealotry of the convert. So these are like oftentimes newcomers to Bitcoin. And just like any convert in like normie religions, if the newcomers oftentimes they're compensating for lost time, and so they're becoming extremely zealous during that time and trying to kind of compensate. And I feel like people who feel like they need to follow a certain Bitcoin diet and have Bitcoin beliefs about sunscreen and all these other like extraneous cultural issues that really have nothing to do with Bitcoin. So they're oftentimes the newcomers. These weren't parts of OG Bitcoin culture.
I love that. You said the zealotry of the convert.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I think there's some truth there.
Yeah.
I'm laughing just before we get rolling here, too. You mentioned sunscreen. What are you talking about? People are anti-sunscreen?
Well, yes. Yeah. I mean, so that's the thing. That's one of the things that peeled back. I used to be a Bitcoin maximalist, and we can go through my history at some point. But one of the things that kind of peeled back the curtain on Bitcoin maximalism for me, and a lot of the cultural things that come along with that, is alongside my like Bitcoin journey, I was also becoming a medical doctor, and I would see these Bitcoiners, but also just kind of contrarian tech people on Twitter and whatnot, making these really outrageous claims about things that I actually knew a lot about. You know, I've actually written peer-reviewed articles on like sunscreen, and I'm a skin cancer surgeon, so this is something I know a lot about, and it made me question, like, if these people, like, they're so confident in this conspiracy stuff, like, maybe I should question what they're saying about, I don't know, economics or all kinds of different things. And so it peeled back the curtain for me, and sunscreen is one of those. Like, people think that sunscreen is bad for you somehow, when we know for sure that, like, it's the most common cancer in the United States. Like 20% of people get like skin cancer. Yeah. So
wasn't there something though that like a lot of this, so not that you shouldn't do sunscreen, but that like some sunscreens had like bad chemicals in them over like the 80s and 90s or something like, or maybe I'm absorbing this through osmosis from conspiracy Twitter.
No, this is true. So there's so the FDA they look at sunscreens continuously. You know, even ones that are approved, they're always kind of testing them continuously. And I don't know how much you want to talk about sunscreens, but
not that much, but yeah.
All right, so there's different types. There's a chemical type that you apply, and people like it because it feels lighter, but your skin absorbs it. And since your skin absorbs it, it gets into your bloodstream. The FDA.
So if there's bad stuff in there, it could be bad for you.
It could be bad, yeah. And so they're looking at that. The FDA still recommends wearing it, but in the meantime, they're investigating it. And I think that the fact that the FDA brought this up, like, is an FDA that's working, right? And we know for sure that there's a real risk of UV damage from the sun. 20% of people get skin cancer. This other thing is like an unknown. These these sunscreens have been around a long time. So I don't know. Let the experts do their job. And I'm an institutionalist, and I trust these people. So.
We're going to get into the institutionalism also. Yeah. Let's take it back to your point. You've been in Bitcoin a long time. I think we met maybe in like 2018.
Yeah,
you and I.
Harvard Square.
Yeah, and you've been in Bitcoin since well before then, though. Tell us how you got into it. It sounds like you were in medical school maybe when you first got interested. Give us your backstory in Bitcoin.
Yeah, so it was late 2012, early 2013. I was in med school, should have been studying for my finals back then, and I was reading an article about the Silk Road and this like crazy money that you had to use to use the Silk Road, and like it was almost immediate. Like, holy shit, this is something that can really change the world, right? If you can have money that's not tied to a state and you can transact freely and no one can stop you. At that time, too, I had a misunderstanding that, you know, Bitcoin was anonymous rather than pseudonymous. But I immediately understood the power of this thing. And so it wasn't maybe just a couple weeks later, and I was sending MoneyGrams overseas to Tokyo to like fund my Mt. Gox account. And that's where I got my original Bitcoin. And I did it the right way. Like I didn't leave my Bitcoin on Mt. Gox, except for I guess I used a paper wallet, which is discouraged nowadays. But
but it was something. It worked.
Yeah, and you know, I didn't make a huge investment because it was hard to get money into Mt. Gox back in the day.
Did you use like Dawala or like there was a bank you could wire to in Japan, I recall, at one point. Yes, it was weird money services you were having to use. It was not easy.
Yeah, you know, I wasn't full-time Bitcoin. I was doing it for fun, and I just kind of stuck with my MoneyGram approach. I did it 3 or 4 times, and then I just thought, you know what, no one knows about this thing yet. It's like really cheap. If my small investment, if this really takes off, my small investment will be worth a lot. And I've mostly held it, so I'm happy about that.
That's impressive, holding for that long too. So, and then like, okay, well, let's fast forward a little bit. We'll talk about, you know. Actually, you know what? Over the years, you've made use of a function on Bitcoin called op return, which tell us what that is and what you've used it for. You're well known for this. I would say on Dennis's Taproot Wizard, he has like a team Taproot Wizard. I guess they've given some away now, but one of the original ones, it was like Eric Wall and Udi Wertheimer and Nick Carter and Dan Held and Dennis and OX Farr, right?
Yeah, he's the artist.
Yeah, but that was like the original. You guys are the founding team.
Yes.
And Dennis's says op return on it. What is that? What we're using that for?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, op return is a function that Bitcoin has where you can put like a small amount of data into the Bitcoin blockchain in a prunable way because it's not part of the UTXO set. And this was kind of a compromise between different warring factions in Bitcoin a long time ago because a lot of people were like trying to hide data as addresses, which bloated the UTXO set, which isn't good for Bitcoin. And there's really no way to prevent people from trying to store data on Bitcoin. So they thought, I think this was the Bitcoin core team's thought at the time was, well, what if we make it so that they can store a tiny amount in a prunable way? Maybe it will offload people's desire to put it, to store it as a UTXO. And I've always been interested in this idea of using Bitcoin for free speech things and for art, well before inscriptions, well before even NFTs on Bitcoin or on Ethereum. And so I've found all different ways to use the op return function to write poems or to put like human rights or political statements. And been doing it a long time. I've still do it today. So.
What do you? What was your wallet that you were using to inscribe an op return in this way? It's not a standard Bitcoin transaction.
Man, I think I just use Bitcoin Core.
Yeah, I mean, you can in Core. Yeah.
Yeah, and then more recently, it's easier to do on the Trezor wallet,
Nice.
Trezor Suite. So
Cool. Dennis has a bunch of political statements. One of the ones that I like that you're extremely pro Taiwan independence, and you've published some interesting. I don't know what we call them. They're like Bitcoin tweets. I mean, they're forever on the blockchain, right?
Yes.
But they're short little statements, and
Yeah, I mean, so the point of back in the day, there was a lot of Bitcoin mining in China, well over 50%. And there used to be this narrative that China controls Bitcoin mining. So
Right.
I had this idea, like, what if I put
and that they would control Bitcoin by controlling Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly, because that's how Bitcoin's consensus is.
Right.
Like that, Bitcoin security relies on its hash power, and if it's all in China, does China control Bitcoin? That was like the FUD that was going around at the time. Now China's banned Bitcoin mining, but back in the day. So anyway, I thought like, well, let me put some message on op return that's you cannot remove from Bitcoin, and that the Chinese state would find subversive. And so I did actually a few different ones. One of them like remember Tiananmen Square or
Right.
Taiwan's an independent nation, things that I truly believe and feel. And so I put those there, and just to prove that China's not going to and can't remove these from
Right.
Bitcoin. That's impossible, right? So
They clearly would if they could.
they would if they could. These things, you can't say these things in China. And yet, in fact, I remember the Taiwan is an independent nation. Transaction was mined by a Chinese miner. It's amazing. And now it has probably 40,000 confirmations or something.
Right.
A lot of them
Buried.
probably from Chinese miners.
Buried.
It ain't never going anywhere.
No.
It's there for good.
I
It's
do love
granite.
your view and use of Bitcoin for this, because it is so born in what we often say, which is that Bitcoin is immutable and permissionless and censorship resistant, right?
Yeah.
And those are great features if you're powering electronic cash.
Yeah.
But they're also incredibly powerful features for electronic speech.
Yes.
And there is nowhere, even on the internet. I mean, I have my own website. I can put stuff up there, but like, I'm not hosting on a server in my house. Like the hosting company could rug me.
Yes.
Even at the DNS level, they can rug me. They can seize the domain, right?
Yeah.
They can't do that on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It's probably the most highest fidelity data storage in the internet in the world.
Yeah, and I remember this was kind of the point, because I've always had a long interest in geopolitics, and Bitcoin was always kind of separate to that interest. And I remember this was the point when I started seeing them converge, like wow, Bitcoin can really be used on a geopolitical level. Like states are going to own Bitcoin, which is now the case, and other states are going to fight Bitcoin, which is now the case. You see China banning Bitcoin mining, and putting political messages on Bitcoin is a natural extension of that. And the convergence of Bitcoin and geopolitics just shows how powerful Bitcoin is, and I think that this is only going to accelerate.
I love that, and let's talk about inscriptions specifically now.
Yeah.
We mentioned it and the Taproot Wizard backstory here a little bit, but you were an early inscriber.
Yeah.
I think I learned about it from you. You wrote a blog about inscriptions quite early. And what's the lowest? What is the first thing you inscribed?
So the first thing that I inscribed was my CryptoPunk. I have a CryptoPunk.
So you own a CryptoPunk on ETH, a Larva Labs, now Yuga Labs issued or whatever.
Yeah, so
Punks.
I own a real CryptoPunk,
Yeah.
and therefore have an exclusive license to the IP of my CryptoPunk. And I put it on Bitcoin because I thought that'd be a cool thing to do. Now my punk's immutable on Bitcoin. So
And you can do that under the Yuga license. So
yeah. So Yuga allows you, or the license
Yeah.
allows the exclusive license holder to make derivatives, basically. So I did that. And it was number 89.
So it's inscription
Quite
number
early.
89, and it's a CryptoPunk, your
Yes,
CryptoPunk.
my CryptoPunk. Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And have you done a lot of inscribing since then? Are you like a often an inscriber?
Yeah, I spent a long time, fucking really long time, writing that article on inscriptions.
Yeah.
When I should have been inscribing, I think.
I think that's right.
I was like, no one's going to read this article. I don't know. Inscriptions, or maybe they take off in a year or something like it.
Right.
Totally misconceived.
I mean, it went parabolic. You wrote that in January.
Mm-hmm.
We caught up, you and I, in early February.
Mm-hmm.
I became inscription pilled after talking with you, or very interested in it, I should say.
Yeah.
We had Casey Rodemore on this show, I think like February 9th or 10th.
Super early still, yeah.
We hung out early February. I inscribed, so I went ahead and inscribed my Twitter avatar, current Twitter avatar with the orange background. Got in on February 7th, so it's 10,888. Just 2 weeks before, we were like at sub 200. And of course, now we know it's, over 10 million.
Yeah, I mean, there is just so much desire for fun, especially in Bitcoin. Like, why do the Ethereans get to have all the fun? I was at an Ethereum event in Montenegro recently, and like these people, they get to have so much fun. They get to have all the nice things. Why don't we get any nice things? And there's been so much desire and pent-up demand for these things in Bitcoin that now that there is an easy way to put art and put JPEGs and all kinds of things on Bitcoin, like there's a huge demand for that. And good riddance, like it's really bringing back good culture to Bitcoin.
All right, so we'll talk about your trip to Zuzalu in a minute, because that's also very interesting. You told me about inscriptions now, though. So you talk about the culture that it's brought to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
What about the sort of long-term thesis then for Bitcoin? Because for a long time, of course, you saw in our office here, we have the Bitcoin white paper on the ceiling. It's Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It's not an electronic. Satoshi didn't design it as an electronic, virtual machine, a general computation blockchain, et cetera. The way newer other blockchains are.
Yeah.
But there's been a view. I think Pete Rizzo has described this quite well between the network maximalists, the platform maximalists, and the monetary maximalists in Bitcoin. With the monetary maximalists being the dominant culture for a long time.
Yeah.
Which is the view that Bitcoin is primarily sound money.
Sure.
But it's very clear that the platform maximalist, the idea was that Bitcoin is a platform for building stuff. It's not just sound money, it's a platform. And this is a more OG idea of people used to say that, altcoins were test nets for Bitcoin. Anything great from an altcoin might one day be incorporated into Bitcoin.
Yes.
Has that door been reopened now with inscriptions?
Man, I have so much to say on this topic. So first of all, I just don't think it's helpful to think about what Satoshi would have wanted, and maybe it's sacrilege. Some people view him as like a religious figure, but what his original thoughts about Bitcoin were in 2008, do they really apply to 2023? I mean, Bitcoin just is at this point.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that, even if Satoshi revealed himself today and wanted to make a change in Bitcoin, there's very little this person can do at this point. So this project has outgrew Satoshi. And speaking more to your later points that you brought up, we need to have, even for the Bitcoin monetary thesis to work, and I believe it. I think Bitcoin is sound money, right? I think that is a use case for Bitcoin that actually has product market fit and is going to take off and succeed. But for that to succeed, we need to have activity on layer one. And there really wasn't any. When I made my CryptoPunk inscription, at number 89 back in January, I think I did one sat for VB or whatever. Yeah. And that's just not sustainable to Bitcoin having continued hash power that is going to secure it as the block subsidy goes away. And now it's been 6 months, right, since inscriptions have came out, and I think we're chugging along at 50 sats per VB or whatever. Yeah. So we really need to have activity, and speculation is good in my opinion on top of Bitcoin, and art and all kinds of things. We need to have these things happening on Bitcoin for Bitcoin to continue to continue to have promise as sound money too.
And you see the door has. You say we need to have it, but is it happening? It's starting. Inscriptions are happening.
Yeah, I mean,
what about more stuff? If people are going to build,
it's so funny.
Inscriptions aren't just art, right? What else? Yeah.
Well, I do want to make this point. There's been many times already in these 6 months where the monetary maximalists or the Bitcoin maximalists, I'll just say, the people who are anti-NFTs, anti-inscriptions. Yeah. There's been many times where they've called inscriptions dead already, where they've called it a fad, and they've, we've had a little downtick in the number of inscriptions, and they'll be like, oh, it's over.
Yeah.
And then it just goes back up again. They find out BRC20 is or some new thing to speculate on. And I don't think humans are going to quit wanting to speculate. I don't think humans are going to quit wanting to look at pretty things or quit wanting to join communities built on tokens or built on JPEGs or whatever. Like, I think Ethereum also, I really appreciate Ethereum for this. It's proven out that this has long-lasting potential and staying power. Like CryptoPunks, which people still love today, I still love mine. You know, it's the first thing I put on Bitcoin. CryptoPunks, I think they started in 2017, right? And, you know, they go up and down, but mostly they go up, right? So I think that you can think of inscriptions and NFTs generally as digital art, and it's not going anywhere. And in fact, I think it's going to go straight up. I don't think it's a fad. Definitely not a fad.
Very interesting. I think it's definitely changing. I mean, I think the Bitcoin culture is expanding. There's some clash happening. If you look at like Bitcoin 2023, which I had a great time at, by the way, phenomenal conference. Bitcoin Magazine has you know, I don't know if I'll say embraced inscriptions, but they're interested in them. There was inscriptions content at the conference. Some hardcore maximalists boycotted the conference over this. You also saw content. I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen that there was content from BTC Prague, which looked like a great conference, by the way. That was that conference was much more anti-inscriptions. This is a clash, a culture clash occurring. Is that healthy for Bitcoin?
It is, yeah. You know, I think, so first of all, I appreciate the monetary maximalists, the people who are only focused on Bitcoin's use case as money. Like, there's no rule that you have to enjoy all the different things that Bitcoin is used for. So I appreciate that. On the other hand, like, I think that the people in Bitcoin who are kind of all swept up in the Bitcoin culture war and contrarianism and, you know, this meat stuff, like, you're not going to convince these people to start wearing sunscreen, right?
Right.
But you're going to grow Bitcoin to include tons more people that they're kind of irrelevant. And I think we've actually achieved that. I don't think that the group that is having the most fun is the group that's going to win. Like, you're not going to win a bunch of people into Bitcoin by advocating some restrictionist religion or like abstention religion. You're going to win by having like the most fun parties and by having pretty things to look at. And, you know, underneath all that is like this extremely robust blockchain that people love, Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That we all love, even these maximalists. But the group that's having the most fun is going to bring in all the new people, and they're going to crowd out these kind of contrarian voices on the fringes. So.
Let's talk about Zuzalu. This is an event that you were at in Montenegro. First of all, you give a fascinating presentation there, which we're going to get into, but what was this event?
Sure, yeah. So Zuzalu, it was a hangout for 2 months in a small town called Lustica Bay in Montenegro. Really beautiful area, kind of right on the Adriatic Sea, not far from Italy. And it was focused mostly on the network state, but especially like Vitalik's vision for the network state. He kind of seeded this idea for us all to get together for 2 months in Montenegro. I only stayed for the very end of it because I have to see patients and things.
Yeah.
But I really loved it.
Practicing medical doctor.
I'm a practicing medical doctor, yes. But I loved it, and I got to meet such interesting people. And it's a convergence of a lot of different points of view. So you had people there who are interested like in life extension. You had people there who are interested in network states, which was kind of like my contribution talking about institutions. And then there's lots of like ZK people there and just like Ethereum scaling people there and all kinds of different groups. And you had like a meeting of the minds. And there was a little Ethereum conference, EdCon, that was happening in a nearby city. And so it was basically an early group getting together talking about network states.
So the network state is what I guess Balaji Srinivasan's promulgated concept, although it's not the first time something like this has been proposed, but the idea that what the future won't just be nation states, it will be network states created on the internet. Is that the base concept?
Yeah, you know, Balaji wrote a book on it. There's other people too working on different concepts and different visions of network states, but the core idea is basically like a digital first community or nation, and depending on the version of it that you believe in or that you advocate for, maybe this digital first community can even can achieve some sovereignty or some autonomy from, you know, more traditional jurisdictions over time, and, you know, influence laws or even become their own freestanding nation. So.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
So you gave a talk there about institutions, and one of my favorites, Dennis has great like I used to love these. These have been around forever, but these surveys where you fill out a survey and it online and it places you in a usually in a 4-box matrix, like it'll be, and you have some that are I think you have a couple of these actually, right? Or you have had several versions over time. But you have one about institutional, where you fall in the institutional spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you gave this talk. So tell us what you said. And you said earlier you're an institutionalist. What does that mean?
Well, so let me answer. You have a few questions there.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry about that.
So I wrote an article and made like a quiz to accompany it that kind of tries to map where your thinking is at in relation to whether you believe institutions that we have today are good, whether they're bad, whether we need to replace them with something else. And the inspiration that I had for this was, back in the day, like with the political compasses that you mentioned, like left and right economic access and left and right social access, they used to really sort people and explain politics well.
Yeah.
Like if you took these quizzes, like you could very clearly find like-minded people based on
You really could.
this.
They were pretty effective.
And the Republican Party was they were pretty consistently socially conservative, economically conservative. The liberal parties in different jurisdictions was pretty liberal, economic and socially. But it just doesn't work anymore. Like our politics today has flipped. And I was trying to make sense of why that was. And what it came down to was that really the politics today, and this isn't just in the U.S., but in a lot of Western or democratic countries, it's basically just either revolt or support of institutions. And there's a lot of things that prompted this. Even going back to the Iraq War, I think was one of the first times where we really started to lose faith in our institutions. But also, just like more recent things like COVID and lockdowns and denial of election results, and all these things are just like really big challenges to the legitimacy of institutions. And so our politics now, you have people on the old left and right who are allies in support of institutions, and you have people on the old left and right who are opposed to institutions. And you see that all the time. And this quiz kind of maps you onto that. Do you support our current institutional hegemons like, I don't know, the UN, the New York Times, NATO, Harvard, things like that, or are you opposed to these things?
Right.
And I guess just as an example to kind of demonstrate this point more, like if you look at institutionalists today, you'll see people who used to be on the left, like Joe Biden, and people who used to be on the right, like Liz Cheney. They're all basically they say the same things now, even though they would have disagreed on core issues in the past, because institutions are upstream of all of these like economic and societal questions. And similarly, among the contrarian group, you have old school liberals like Noam Chomsky or RFK Jr., who are all of a sudden allies with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and these kind of right-leaning contrarian types.
Because they're reformers, they want to overturn the
institutions. They see, I mean, I hate to disparage this group, but they see like Russia invade Ukraine and they're like, oh, that's NATO's fault. Like they find the fault rather than they find fault in the institutions.
In our institutions.
Yeah, the institutional hegemons, basically.
Yes, yeah.
So whether it's the WHO, the New York Times, like these people hate the New York Times. And they are always disparaging, like in a lot of these places, like the WHO deserves criticism, but should we reform it? Or is it just like rotten, like the contrarians think, that we just need to replace it wholesale with something else,
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating analysis.
Thank you.
And where do you stand? You clearly are if you're in support of institutions as a concept.
Yeah.
And if there's something wrong, you'd say reform rather than tear down.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, and I believe that the institutions we have today are really valuable. I think NATO is extremely important. I think that if we got rid of NATO or NATO disappeared or NATO fractured or something, it'd be untold calamity across the world, right? Not just for economics, but imperial countries would get bigger. Other countries, there'd be lots of death and dying, and we don't want a world without NATO. And similarly, like even though I'm very critical of the UN, like the UN Human Rights Council has Cuba and Saudi Arabia on the council, which is just crazy. But there's still things that the UN does that is worth preserving. And so what my perspective is these institutions, the New York Times, et cetera, we need to reform these and make them better.
Yeah.
Even with crypto, with Bitcoin, with technology.
So you're not a crypto anarchist.
No, I'm not. And I have a lot of skepticism towards the point of view that we can, just like, I'm just going to put all my reliance in MetaMask and, or all my reliance in just like, 21 million equals 21 million. Like, that's not a
Don't matter, bro. Bitcoin don't care, right?
Exactly.
That's not enough.
Like, I used to, because the reason why I'm so critical of this take is because this is how I used to think back in high school, right?
Yeah.
I used to be like a huge Ayn Rand kid, and I was super into the Libertarian Party and the Free State Project. But once you travel and you meet other kinds of people and you get like more complicated, nuanced views of the world, and also critically, once you're like me and you're having to work with patients who rely on these systems, like maybe they're oftentimes immigrants, they rely on Medicaid, they rely on Social Security continuing to function, you can't then advocate for system collapse. And also care about people like that, because it's going to hurt those people.
Yeah.
And so we need to advocate that our institutions stay resilient. And maybe that means that the Fed needs to have some Bitcoin on its balance sheet or something. But just
rather than end the Fed, reform the Fed.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Fed probably needs more upheaval than some of these other institutions.
That's just the one example, but yes, I think that's the analogy.
A lot of institutions do a pretty darn good job. I think NATO does a good job. I actually like the New York Times; they do really good investigative.
What about the U.S.
and
government? Does that do a good job on?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and it depends on what point in history you're talking about.
And also, that's a giant organization I mentioned. That's not just one institution, but
yeah, and I think it deserves some upheaval. We're going through upheaval now with it. Yeah, we need to get better people elected, and we need to reform how our elections work. And but I'm not saying that like let's overthrow the U.S. government and replace it with a smart contract. And there's also there's not room for all.
Is that what people at Zuzalu were suggesting?
No, but there is this
replacing governments with like immutable code.
Well, I think so. The more reasonable people in Zuzalu who like network states, and I include myself in this group, I think network states are cool. What we advocate for is, very, very slow, piecemeal kind of autonomy. So first, maybe it's just like a group chat, like we're in some group chats together, and maybe what if we all decide that we want to throw in a Bitcoin and start a political action?
So now we have a treasury. The group chat has a treasury.
Yeah, and we can start a pact with that treasury and try to influence some laws. And then if we show ourselves to be maybe good stewards of that money and become trustworthy, and maybe some of us get elected to offices, we can slowly over time advocate for more laws that we agree with, and maybe someday we can get some autonomy in a limited way.
Formality around that network state.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we can issue our own residency cards, or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, and it's not a tear down and rebuild. It's a work in the system, reform the system. Find your place.
That's my view. That's
right.
Like, there's definitely the other side. Like to network states too. There's like this division. So there's this other side of like accelerationists who think that, the institutions that we have today are just rotten to the core, and financial collapse is inevitable, and the UN and NATO are rotten, and we just need to exit these things. And Bitcoin is your life raft. And the problem is there's like not enough room in Singapore for all of us to exit to. And like I'd said before, like there's untold calamity that would happen if suddenly you don't have the United Nations and NATO and the experts in charge of things where they actually have true expertise, not just like political appointees, but true experts who have domain knowledge. Like we actually rely on these people for the functioning of society. But there's a big group within network states who really advocates for pushing through this like fourth turning type calamity, so that their ideal utopian crypto society can emerge on the other side.
I was looking at my phone because I was reviewing one of our conversations, because I recalled the term accelerationist that you brought up, which is a great term. It's very clearly, and I think I said at the time, I'm not anti-institution at all. I just think a lot of these institutions are too effed up to save. And you were like, that is the accelerationist view, basically. That is
no, I mean, so accelerationist even goes a step further.
Let's collapse them.
Yeah, exactly right. So these are people like there's people who trying to think of a good example, but there are groups that like think that a civil war is inevitable, and so they'll try to play both sides of it.
May as well just have it happen now.
Yeah, exactly. Like bring it sooner so that we can get through it.
No, I mean a lot of people
who try to spark bank runs.
I was going to say take the debt ceiling debate. A lot of people said let it default. Let it default.
Yeah. The archetype, the type of person that looks at our inflation numbers coming down, like inflation improving, and they're like, oh shit, these are the accelerationists, right? They're like, oh, I'm long Bitcoin.
I'm long chaos.
I'm short the world.
Yeah, they want to be long chaos and short
Exactly.
stability.
And so this is the problem. This is another reason why you want to have a normie job, because you need to have some kind of investment in the continuing functioning of society to be a good person.
I like that you brought this up, because a lot of people ask me, like, Alex, how can I get involved in Bitcoin, or how can I work in crypto or whatever? And you know, I mean, depending, you can be mega interested in Bitcoin or crypto or other parts of crypto, and don't have to make it your job, right? I mean, you can. There's an industry out here with jobs, right? But I love it when I meet people who are just like big Bitcoiners or big Ethereans that just like have some other non-crypto job.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean,
that's why I always liked introducing you as a medical doctor. I always just think it's kind of funny because we don't have that many people come by like Galaxy or the studio that aren't in crypto full time.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, you do a lot of stuff in crypto, like extracurricularly though. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I think that so I mean, if you really want Bitcoin to be like to take over, especially if you believe like in what's it called? Bitcoin, like running the whole world.
Hyper-Bitcoinization.
Yeah.
The idea is it's hyperinflation, but it's Bitcoinization.
Yeah, all the people in hyper-Bitcoinization, they're not going to be like Bitcoin VC investors.
They have to be regular people.
Exactly, right. So, but I also think that having a normie job is important because it makes you advocate for normal people and not for the collapse of society. And it also helps you see what problems, what friction points that normal people have that you might neglect if you are just kind of crypto native all the time.
Yeah.
So I think it's super important to have a foot in the real world and not just be totally entrenched in crypto all the time.
That's true no matter whether you do or don't work in crypto, by the way.
Yeah, if you work in crypto, you can volunteer.
And get out and touch grass and meet people and get out of your bubble. I'm laughing. There was an episode of South Park that for some reason is coming to my mind, a quite old one. You may remember this. Where the hippies all come to town and they're like, no, man, we don't need the town. They're kind of like anarchists, hippies. Yeah. And they're like, no, dude, we don't need the town, man. We get rid of the local government, dude. Like, but like, what if you had a place, bro, where like there was a man who baked bread and like when you needed bread, like you gave him stuff for the bread. And then he just like, then there was a school, there was a place kids could like go and learn, man. And the kids are like, you mean like a town?
Exactly.
They're like a town.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes me think of the anti-institutionalists versus the, I guess more realistic institutionalists, right? People are like, no, dude, we can do this all different. It's like, dude, we have that currently. That is society. You just want it do it slightly better or slightly differently.
Yeah. There's another meme that really describes this well that I posted the other day, where it's the old school political compass.
Yeah.
And there's like a person missing a brain on each of the four corners, but they all have the same thought, which is, I can't wait for society to collapse and my ideal utopia can emerge.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not just the libertarians who think this, right? If it was, maybe libertarianism would have some shot of emerging from this chaos, but also the authoritarians are thinking this. They want to have Russia and the CCP on the march after the collapse. And so rather than advocating for that, let's try to make the world work.
I like that. Yeah. This is a great conversation, Dennis. Anything else you want to throw out here before we wrap? I mean, I would encourage people to read Dennis's writing. It's quite good.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I've learned a lot from it. And but what are you thinking? What's next in your near-term horizon?
Man,
Bitcoin-wise, or anything,
I just hodl Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is supposed to be boring on the base layer, and then we need to have fun on the things on top of it, whether it's inscriptions or whatnot. And I'm optimistic about the world. I'm optimistic about Bitcoin, and I think those two actually can work really well together, and we don't have to usurp one for the other to succeed.
Great final thought. Dennis Pourteaux, medical doctor, my friend, Taproot Wizard, founder of Quat Ventures, and a great author on Substack. Check him out. Thanks for joining Galaxy Brains.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of Galaxy Brains. Thank you for listening. Hey, thanks to our guest, Dennis Pourteaux, one of my old friends. Really happy to have him on the show. I thought it was a really great interview. Hope everyone has enjoyed the long weekend. And look, we'll be back next week as always. Until then, have a great and safe weekend. We'll see you soon. Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXY Research. See you next week.